If someone asked me, what is the most ridiculous game you could ever imagine? My immediate answer would be Dead Rising 2. This game has it all. From the stereotypical zombie storyline, to over-the-top violence, all the way to crazy psychopaths that are littered throughout the environment as a result of the outbreak. There is just so much to get out of this game. Since this game came out in 2012, I have played this countless times. I'm not even kidding when I say I probably run through the entire storyline about 20 times start to finish. And it's only on my most recent playthrough that I'm showing here did I finally experience everything the game has to offer. Of course, with the help of a guide. And before we dive any deeper, if you've never played any of the Dead Rising series, I really only recommend playing this one. While the first game did kick off the series, it came out long enough ago where it still feels extremely janky, and I don't think the story can keep up with this one, and Dead Rising 3 and 4 were absolute flops. There were some people that really enjoyed them, but I don't think it has the quality in the storytelling that this game does. You really have to appreciate just how crazy it is that they got a game like this to run on the PS3 and Xbox 360 all those years ago. Their number of AI instances is truly remarkable, and it's even impressive to this day. Now, don't get me wrong, although the zombies are part of the aesthetic of this game, it gets super frustrating when you're just trying to get from point A to point B. It's a cool novelty early on, but it really quickly fades when it's constantly getting in your way while you're moving through different story missions and side quests. But I guess it sort of promotes a bit of realism in the concept that they're trying to drive with this game. During my first few playthroughs, one of the things that really bothered me about this game is the constant timer that is always running in the background and is counting down the amount of time you have for missions. While it's cool that everything happens in a certain time, it becomes really difficult to balance which missions you're going to go after while not allowing what they call the truth to escape by not getting to the story missions on time. In my last playthrough, I did get through every single encounter, so I can confirm it is possible, but you do have to really be on top of it and hyper-optimize every second they give you in-game to be able to complete the story missions and the side missions in conjunction. And there are definitely parts where I just like to appreciate sort of the beauty of the environment they created, and don't want it to have to just be rushing to the next mission. So if I had to give a real negative of this game, that's definitely it. But now let's get to all of the positive aspects of this game, and trust me, there are many. And I really think that this game mastered the fetch quest concept. In so many other games, it is super boring and repetitive, but with the varying mission design and the different tasks you have to do on each of the fetch quests, which basically amount to bringing survivors back to the safe house, it really keeps them entertaining and fun to do. There were literally well over 100 people to bring back to the safe house throughout the game, and there was never a single time where I got frustrated or dreaded trying to bring some of them back. They really put a lot of variance in all the encounters that you go through. And another cool thing is, some of them they actually had them as a hostage of the psychopaths. So it wasn't just go to point A, do something for the survivor, and then go back to point B, which is the safe house. It was more of go to point A, and go through this elaborate scheme with one of the psychopaths, and then bring them back afterward. Making for a really cool mission reward, which is not just XP handed to you, but another layer on top of everything you've already had to do. One thing I've really always been impressed by with the Capcom team is their ability to show desperation in some of the psychopaths that they create in these games. Even the later games that I mentioned were quote-unquote not as good as Dead Rising 2, it's so interesting the way they bring out different personality types in people and then show how they would devolve into insanity after a crazy event like a zombie outbreak. There's just this degree of humanity that you see in a lot of it underneath all of the psychotic nature that brings a little bit of life to an otherwise barren, dead environment. No discussion about this game would be complete without talking about the customizable, buildable weapons that are available throughout the completion of the game. This is what makes the sandbox aspect of this game really shine through. It is so creative the way they took everyday items and then built them into weapons that you could use against zombies in this game. And it's even more cool that a lot of these combo cards, they call, that are used to build these weapons, are granted throughout missions in the game, and they seem to really make sense in the scope of that mission. Just adding a little bit of extra to an already rewarding experience for getting through these missions. And although the protagonist of this game, Chuck, is sort of outside of Frank West and his storyline that you come to expect in the Dead Rising series, I feel like he makes the most sense in the grand scheme. And so interesting how they use the past outbreaks to sort of build the character behind Chuck, with the need to get Zombrex for his daughter throughout the game to ensure that she doesn't turn. And to further this, the insanity that he falls into to know that the outbreak here was not only created on purpose, but it was created to make the drug that he needs for his daughter to survive. And it's so interesting how a lot of the psychopaths that are in the main story of the game were originally on board with this plan, but they slowly devolved as the outbreak took place, with TK and Sullivan being sort of the two main culprits in all of this, with Sullivan being a little bit more on the path, and then TK getting extremely greedy and taking advantage of the city by looting all the casinos. It's just something that you could really believe and predict almost if something like this were to happen in a real world scenario. Opportunistic people looting the city is like the first thing that would occur. Another big aspect of this game that I loved is the rank up progression system that carries through multiple playthroughs in New Game Plus. It's easy to get through 2 to 3 playthroughs even before getting to the level cap, and it's really cool to see how the game changes when you have a much lower skilled character to a much higher skilled character. And one thing that really helps is when you get increased movement speed, that actually makes it more possible to complete everything on time, as you may have a big challenge getting through every single story mission if you don't have the movement speed increase that you get at higher ranks. And this adds a really cool degree of replayability, as it actually unlocks part of the game that you couldn't really access on your first playthrough. That's very unique, and I can't really think of any other games that have done something like that up until this point. And that makes a lot of games in New Game Plus mode much less compelling, in my opinion. And on top of this, there are multiple endings to this game, some of which are more canon and some are more happy ending type, but it's cool to go through the game and see how different scenarios can play out if you say don't complete the facts on time, which is a later story mission to clear your name, or if you don't give Katie Zombrex on time. All of these change the outcome that you'll have at the end of the game, which is really cool because I think there's around 10 different endings. The quick thing I want to add is that when it comes to Dead Rising 2, there is the original base game Dead Rising 2, and then Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, which is sort of a remake, change of the storyline that shows how Frank West would have come through the events of this game. In my opinion, it seemed like a little bit of a cash grab, as most of the story missions are completely identical. They did change the map around a little bit, add an amusement park, and change some of the endings, but I still think the original game plays a lot better and makes a lot more sense in the scope of the storyline they're trying to show, as Frank West doesn't really fit in. They did keep some of the core mechanics by making you be the one who needs the Zombrex instead of your daughter, and most of the ending types, but I still think it was a lot more interesting the first time around. And plus, they made Stacy the villain in the second game, which is a little bit bizarre, especially in the context of the story, with her being part of the Cure, which is the activist group that's against all of the terrorism reality and other events of the game. But again, that's something that each individual person has to decide. I know a lot of people liked Off the Record, but if you've never played them, definitely go for the original Dead Rising 2 and leave Off the Record for a future playthrough should you want to try it. I will give credit where it's due though. It is kind of interesting to have a game made and looked at through the lens of a different character with basically the same storyline. That's another thing I've never really seen other series do. I'm sure there are some games that have done that in the past. It's not a brand new concept, but again, that's something that's pretty unique when you compare it to other AAA titles, especially from a company like Capcom. And while we're on the topic of Off the Record and the original game, I highly, highly, highly recommend playing this on PC. It honestly runs so well at a really high consistent frame rate, especially on modern hardware, and it brings the game to a new level that just can't be experienced on the original consoles. And please stay away from the remastered versions on the PS4 and Xbox One, because I've tried them and they are absolute garbage. One thing I remember when I was playing Off the Record on the PS3 years ago was that in certain sequences the game would literally run in single-digit FPS numbers, and it was so painful to get through. Of course, all of this is no longer a problem on the PC port, so definitely pick it up on that platform if you're considering playing this today, as it's really going to ruin the experience if you try playing it on the original consoles. It was just a little bit too ambitious for the hardware that existed at the time. I applaud them for that, but the end result is not as optimal as it should be. One thing I think they handled really well, and to be quite honest, nailed, is the way the story of this game transpires from start to end. I think it was so on point, the way they made it so that Chuck was the one who was framed for the entire outbreak, and the way they justified it was quite brilliant, being that he was sort of angry for his wife's passing after the original outbreak 5 years prior. And the way you have to go through the entire game trying to more or less clear your name against everything that has happened. And of course, everyone is against you, being that they created a footage showing that Chuck, in his outfit after the Terror's reality show at the beginning, was the one who actually started the entire outbreak. And needless to say, like with everything else in this game, you have to use the psychopaths littered throughout the city to sort of build a case for yourself from start to the end of the game. This sounds like a ridiculous task, and that's because it is. And it's so ironic that the entire time you're trying to build a case to show Sullivan your trustworthiness before the military arrives, and through all of that, he was the one who started everything and knew it was all a sham. It's just the poker face that he put on was so impressive when you're looking at the entire scope of the game. It was one of the biggest twists in any game I've ever played that I truly didn't see coming when he executed Rebecca at the end of the game. It's truly a game with a twist after twist after twist, and they're all really well timed. None of them are tacky and sort of cliche, which is what I feel like you get in most other titles out there. And any cliche nature they use is merely for comedic relief, which is something they use a lot in this game to sort of lighten up the tone, which is otherwise extraordinarily dark, and that's what you'd expect. It really just feels a lot like a Capcom game with that sort of arcade nature. And when speaking of arcade nature, I sort of love how everything is really gamified, especially with the way XP pops on screen and the way rewards are displayed to the player throughout the game. This really provides that contrast that I was speaking of earlier. And it's something that you'll really enjoy if this is your first time through. And it's something that'll keep you entertained from start to finish, even on later playthroughs as well. Another incredible turn of events in the story is the introduction of the military that comes about 3/4 of the way through the storyline. This is when you expect everything to end and the game to come to a more happy ending, and of course, like everything else, there is a major turn that ruins everything that you've built up to. That being the release of the gas that makes the zombies even more powerful and, you guessed it, more frustrating to deal with later on in the game, as they get stronger, more dangerous, faster, and harder to fend off. And that becomes immediately evident when you see that they took out an entire military column when they first came to the city. Although it can be frustrating, it does add a bit of challenge that is really much needed in the open world itself. And I think the timing of it is really good, as once you get to a higher level, the zombies become really trivial, and adding this sort of super zombie to the mix really spices up the difficulty and the enjoyability of the open world. And it's something that I welcome in the end, although it can be a little bit challenging at times. And with all of this said so far, it brings me to why I think this is one of the best zombies games of all time. In the scope of this conversation, I'm leaving out games like The Last of Us because it's not really a zombies game, although a lot of people sort of attribute it to that. It's not down this classic zombies outbreak experience that we're looking at here, so we'll leave that game out for now. But I feel like there's a good chance I am going to cover those games in the future, so do stay tuned for that, because in a whole different way, I absolutely love Naughty Dog and the Last of Us series. When I compare this to other games like Dead Island, which I'm also a really huge fan of, by the way, I think this one stays a little bit more true to the Outbreak aesthetic, let's call it. I did find the way they did Dead Island really interesting. In the start on this island resort, and then everything going to hell really quickly. And even having the 4 main protagonists be immune to the disease that everyone else is succumbing to. That was really impressive in my opinion, and I also really liked the way they did the leveling system and the upgradability of weapons that you could have on you for much longer. That was really welcome in comparison to the much more arcade style of Dead Rising. Another game I feel is important to be spoken about in the context of these Outbreak games is definitely Dying Light, which I feel incorporates a lot of both of the 2 games I've mentioned so far, those being Dead Rising 2 and Dead Island. It is of course a lot more modern than both these games, so you have to be careful when you're trying to compare them, as it's a little bit unfair when a lot better architecture, hardware, and game development practices have come out since these earlier games. But I think the real strength of Dying Light, of course, is the parkour and movement system, and that's something you're really going to come to appreciate when you play the really janky Dead Rising 2, and of course even Dead Island. Because these games are painfully buggy, but it's something that you just sort of have to appreciate as part of the experience. And that's how I really tend to enjoy it. Because you're expecting a glitch-free and really smooth running game, this definitely isn't the one for you. But none of the glitches are game-breaking like they can be in many other games. And that's where I think this strikes the balance of being a little bit buggy, but still fully functional at the same time. And that adds for some really funny outcomes throughout the game. And the AI really does show its age, especially when you have followers behind you, that could get so frustrating in the way they interact with the open world. But the good thing is, if you do run away from them, eventually they will figure out the buggy mess that they're going through. And although some critics didn't like a lot of this game, there's just so much value that can be found in this game with its nearly endless outcomes, extensive storyline, and deep, interesting side quests that are varied in every encounter that you have. This makes this game on discount today such an easy and automatic buy. The amount of hours you can get out of this game for sometimes buying it for $5 is just unbelievable, and I don't see a way that you could spend money better than that, to be honest. Especially with a lot of modern games just being pay-to-win cash grabs, this is going to be a really refreshing change of pace if that's most of what you've been experiencing. And at least I know I have. One thing I do recommend against on this game is playing the multiplayer function. Not only is it filled with hackers like everything else, given the age of it, multiplayer and co-op seems like something that was sort of a lackluster afterthought for this game. And that's definitely frustrating, as I think there was a lot of potential for this, but the way the game is architected, it doesn't make sense to play in a co-op fashion like it does in games like Borderlands, for example, which are ground-up, purpose-built co-op games that are always better with a friend. And it becomes extremely obvious that it was an afterthought because they don't even have a second playable character for your co-op partner. You're both just Chuck. Which is really derpy and weird, especially since it's a third-person game, and if you're running next to each other, it can literally get confusing which one you are. It leads to a lot of funny encounters, though, as you'll see Chuck's character sort of switch during cutscenes, because it doesn't know which one it should reconcile at the time. But if you can get past all of this, I did play through this game start to finish with a friend of mine, and we still had a ton of fun doing it. It's just, again, not refined, so don't expect a really high-end experience. One thing that I do think was really cool that is completely broken and gone, especially in the remastered versions where they've removed it entirely, is Terra's Reality Online, which was not only a cool minigame that you could play with people around the world, but it was a way to make money that you could port into the main game to spend to make either the game easier or level up your character. It's just really frustrating that this functionality is completely gone, as it did make a lot of things in the game, especially like affording the $2 million SUV, a lot easier. Of course, there are workarounds like getting the gambling magazines, which allow you to win a lot of money really fast on the slot machines, but it's still a really tedious and monotonous process that could sometimes involve sitting there for an hour just pressing the space bar over and over again, which gets really monotonous and annoying, especially because you constantly have zombies swarming you, and it's just the biggest frustration that I can't even describe. And I think this is something that they thought of originally when the game came out, so you had the option to either do the gambling aspect or the online aspect, but now the online aspect in Terra's Reality is gone. It kind of really ruins the experience, and I would say that's one of the biggest negatives of playing this game today versus when it came out well over a decade ago. But that in and of itself is a more global issue that we've seen with modern titles. That being falling off support for games that are well over 5 or even 10 years old. And of course this makes sense. You can't expect a company to provide infinite and endless support for a game, especially when it's not really making them any money anymore. So I think a lot of it, unfortunately, comes down to the community and their ability to not ruin these experiences for everyone else. It's always the hackers that come in and break these servers that sort of ruins a lot of the character of these old games, with Dead Rising 2 being another casualty of this. And it of course goes even deeper and further than that. If you look at some games like Black Ops 3, where when you try to play zombies online, there's a legitimate chance of getting malware injected on your computer because of old common vulnerabilities that are being exploited on these games. Should the developers do something about this? Probably, but again, at the same time, that costs a lot of money and requires a lot of resources to go back and back out all of these problems for really no financial gain. And what a lot of these companies do, unfortunately, is just make the decision to shut down the servers altogether, much like they did on Dead Rising 2. It's just safer for the consumer, and it cost Capcom nothing, which is the path they're going to go down. Respectable that they're protecting people's privacy, but at the same time, unfortunate because we've lost a really excellent mode. And I think a lot of this speaks to some of the broader issues that we're having with modern games, in that everything is extremely financially driven, rather than in respect for the art that all of this is about in the end. But like with everything else, once a form of creativity can become profitable, big tech and big corporations are going to come after it. And there's no place we've seen that more than in gaming as a whole. With these old classic games left behind, and the new, like I mentioned earlier, pay-to-win structure where quality story-driven games have been all but left behind, and microtransactions in skins and multiplayer games are the new absolute norm. Still really awesome games, but it's unfortunate that we've lost this old tradition that we had all these years, as there are still a lot of people that enjoy these story-driven games and the casual nature of them. I think that's what it really comes down to. Everything they're trying to turn into a competitive, just pit of hell, effectively. And that really detracts from the experience that you could have with these games in the end, as everything is financially driven and designed to make people come back more and invest more in the platform. And with that, it's super easy for them to just end support for these old games because they're not making them any money and the microtransactions are not coming through. And of course, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, or that only old games are good. This is not the case at all. Clearly, with some of the amazing titles that we have today. It's just really unfortunate to see incredible games like this die and fade out of relevance just because of people hacking into different platforms, and the developers completely ending support for games that they originally invested tens, if not in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars into in the past. I just feel there's a degree of respect that should be paid to a lot of these titles. But with all of that, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do like and subscribe. It helps me out so much, and I look forward to bringing many more videos like this in the future. See you in the next one.